Welcome back to Analysis, where we've been discussing Boko Haram following the international outrage at the kidnapping of hundreds of schoolgirls. In this half of the programme, we'll be talking about Boko Haram's origins, how it's been gaining influence in Nigeria, as well as wider issues of government corruption in the country. Still with me are Lindsay German, convener of the Stop the War Coalition, and Lagan Akinole, who's a Nigeria analyst at Think Africa Press. We're joined by Bala Mohammed Liman, who's a doctoral candidate at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And on the line, we're joined by Dr. Olawale Ishmael, who's research head at the group International Alert. All welcome back to the programme. Bala, welcome to the programme. There's some background here which isn't in most of the mainstream press reports. For instance, that the Boko Haram group didn't start off as an armed or terrorist group. So what do you know about this, and how important do you think it is that we understand this kind of point of origin?
Well, the whole problem with radicalization in Nigeria is that it doesn't normally start off as an armed group, and Boko Haram didn't start off like that. Its initial leader, Muhammad Yusuf, just sort of was preaching this need for a return to pure Islam. And it sort of spiraled out of control in 2009 when his group was attacked by security forces and his mosque was burnt down. And he was killed extrajudicially by the security forces. And then the group re-emerged in 2010 and became this violent group that we see now. So initially it wasn't about trying to take over the government by force. It was more about trying to preach a return to basic fundamental tenets of Islam.
Again, I mean, there's quite a bloody history of attacks on the group by the Nigerian government, and this certainly isn't in the press, isn't it? You would think this was a kind of absolutely insane kind of outbreak of madness, and that there was no prehistory at all.
I think we must make a definition between global world press and local Nigeria press. Global press, they have their gatekeepers who choose what issues are hot and what's not. Whereas at the time, local insurgency in a northwest state in Nigeria is not news. But Nigerian press have covered it on numerous occasions. Local press is fully aware of the atrocities that have been caused since the killing of Muhammad Yusuf. And they report on it, and it grows, and it grows, and it grows. But riots and groups along those lines have been around. The Kafan Chan riots of 1986, that was one of the first instances where people, on the guise of radical Islam, took it upon themselves to create chaos in the town and got suppressed by the military of Babangida at that time. So you have the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, small pockets of insurgencies and how do I say, and riots and chaos have happened, but to a smaller extent than what we have now. Now it's a version of an evolution of madness, I think.
I mean, Lindsay, how far do you think that the Western perceptions are now moulded by the fact that practically any government that wants to deal with an insurgent problem in its own country immediately reaches for the war on terror rhetoric? I mean, this is now being played back to Western governments by the El-Sisi regime in Egypt, by the Assad regime in Syria, by the regime in Kiev about people in the eastern Ukraine. I mean, it's kind of, it's ready-made rhetoric, but distorting.
I think it's totally distorting, because this idea that this is global war on terror and that there's the right-minded governments all over the world who are trying to battle against these completely irrational people is not one that takes into account the realities, as has been explained, the specific realities in this case about why these grievances build up, which doesn't in any way justify what happened, but do at least try to explain it. But more importantly, I think when you look at the economic war that's being waged against people in a whole number of countries, as we were discussing earlier, but particularly in Nigeria, the levels of inequality, the levels of corruption. It's actually a very, very rich country in resources and in the wealth of some people, but most people haven't benefited. And you do feel there is a sense that everywhere we have to be talking about more military to combat this terrorism. Maybe if this kind of money was put into education, dare I say, educating girls, but we might see a very different picture. And I think this is never looked at. We don't look at the wider question. We don't look at why something that happened, for example, in Libya and Algeria, then might have an effect on other countries. And yet these things are very much connected, and they're connected as well to the older colonial questions, as we were talking about earlier. You know, Africa gained its independence, but then had all sorts of problems economically and politically, and then was blamed for these problems. That's been the history for decades now, and we have to look at the background to it.
Dr. Ismail, thanks for joining us. We've begun to touch on now on the questions of economic deprivation. I mean, it's a kind of gangster neoliberal government, I suppose you could say. How big a factor do you think that has been in the growing influence of Boko Haram?
I think first, just to say that I'm speaking in my private capacity as a Nigerian and as a Nigerian analyst. We've been involved in research on this subject over the past 8 to 10 years. First, is to say that what you see as Boko Haram in the northeast corner of Nigeria is not an isolated event. It is connected to reactions and responses by sections of the population, especially young people across Nigeria. It is just that in the northeast region, it has taken a religious dimension. If you go to the south-south region, the oil-producing south-south region of Nigeria, you also had insurgency there. Even in the southwest, between 1999 and 2003, you also had, ethnic militias mushrooming as insurgents there. What this clearly explains is that there are subsisting structural conditions, especially economic issues, economic conditions related to poverty in Nigeria that do make insurgencies quite an attractive proposition to many young individuals or young people in Nigeria using violent means as modes of expression to their disapproval to some of those structural issues related to poverty, related to huge social inequality, related to massive corruption by the politicians since 1999. But in the special case of the northeast region where you have Boko Haram, it has taken on a deeper significance and, it has been a bit more intense because of 2 or 3 factors. The first is that on average, that region is the poorest region in Nigeria. The poverty rate in that region is about 10 to 20% more than the national average. That is one. Secondly, is that since 1999, when Nigeria returned to democratic rule, many of the socio-economic opportunities that have been created in Nigeria are likely as a result of neoliberal reforms in the telecom industry, in the banking and financial sector, in the oil and gas sector, and a few other sectors as well. They have been led by the private sector investment, and where you have private sector investment in Nigeria, they don't care about national quota, meaning that they don't care whether they employ people from one section of the country or they are all the sections of the country are employed, represented in the employment cadre. It is simply about who is able to do the job, who is best qualified. And unfortunately, that region in Nigeria, had or has the lowest illiteracy and education rate, meaning that many of the socio-economic opportunities that have been created since 1999, they have been exploited, or they've gone to many people from the south, which had subsisting better, levels of literacy, better education.
Okay, well, just let me stop you there and bring Bala back in. So, I mean, that picture that the Dr. Ismail's painted there is quite an in-depth picture of social deprivation and some social factors that influence this particular part of Nigeria. So, against that kind of background, do you think that the talk of it being an Al Qaeda franchise, which is now in the press, I mean, it's kind of pretty meaningless sort of way of looking at the problem, isn't it?
I think so. I think the problem is I mean, as the doctor said, problem is more about socio-economic, lack of socio-economic opportunities in that region and the level of inequalities in the country as a whole. There's a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployed youth that are miling around, and they become easy pool for these radical groups to recruit from. And that's the situation we have. So we have to, if we're thinking about resolutions and how to sort this problem out, we have to think about how we're going to reduce these inequalities and make groups like Boko Haram less attractive to the young, give them a space where they can expend their energy. Because once that doesn't exist, then groups like that will keep on springing up, and problems like this will probably persist.
Again, I mean, all right, you know, we've got a kind of picture of this being a particular area, a particularly poor area. Within that area, how influential are Boko Haram?
How influential are they? I think, personally, I would like to take a perspective from a historical standpoint. Colonial periods, when the north and south of Nigeria were two separate and got amalgamated into one, the north, when it came to education, which may I add is a very big issue in the whole factor of Boko Haram and the depressive state of the north, they preferred to verge more towards Islamic teaching, and only Western education was for the elites, and the average person was taught in Islamic. And when you look at the world we live in at this current point, Western education is a way to success. It's a way to live in the current situation. You must have all angles in order for you to succeed. Now, the South, which is a mixture of Christian and the Muslims, but have various different ethnic groups, they rush towards Western education. If you look at all the companies, all the big businessmen, everyone who occupies the high roles there, they tend to be Southerners. At the same time, when you have a situation where a whole region is incapable of fighting in the world that we live in, at the same time as the government being incapable to change their lives in any various ways, that makes it very attractive to join a group like Boko Haram, because you have no resources, you have no way out of the struggle.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I mean, let me just put it to you, because you know, as sort of clearly and concisely as I can, because there's a very important element in the discussion. I mean, the Independent newspaper, for instance, described Boko Haram as a medieval, and this is you know, the language that we're familiar with hearing about certain Muslim groups. But in actual fact, what you're saying is this is a very modern reaction to, well, what would be called in more developed societies social exclusion.
Social exclusion, yes, I truly do believe that. But the question is, whose fault is the social exclusion itself? You must look at the individual state governments. You must look at the government on the whole. Majority of them, sadly, are busy, benefiting themselves financially through the federal budget, rather than investing in schools, in the universities, in training workshops. So at the same time, they've been socially excluded due to various factors that have been caused by the inability of the government to change the way that they govern their people. So how do you expect those without means to actually perform a doable life? So when you have a group like Boko Haram who are saying, we'll feed you, we'll clothe you, we'll give you a shelter to become your own person, you have no other option to be included in this group.
You see, in this picture, Lindsay, I mean, the talk of deployment of the SAS and whatnot, I mean, it kind of beggars belief that this could make very much difference in this.
Well, it would be farcical if it wasn't such a serious situation. I mean, the idea that the SAS, with the, you know, the kind of militaristic approach that they have, could in any way solve these kind of very deep and complex problems, which are to do not simply with can you rescue a group of girls from one place, which even there I would be sceptical about a small group of special forces from Britain being able to do it. But even if that were the case, it clearly is about so much more than this. And the sort of the knee-jerk sort of Sun-type headline response to these sorts of things, I think, does nobody any favour at all. I think we need to look at why these things happen. We need to say there are very, very big problems in the world, many of them exacerbated by precisely the governments who are now throwing their hands up in outrage at this, as you say, at medievalism, at backward attitudes. These are terrible attitudes to girls, and I don't think anybody or most people in the world would defend them, of any religion. But at the same time, we have to look at all the wider questions. If we don't look at them, then we're just behaving in a totally ignorant fashion towards these kind of problems.
I mean, Dr. Ismail, I mean, in this sense, if there were any meaning to the term international community, wouldn't the international community be nearer the mark if it said to the Nigerian government, your social and economic policies are worsening this situation, even if you're not directly responsible for it. And if you want any more help from us, you better get on the case of social inequality.
Yes and no. I mean, personally, I welcome the internationalization of the Boko Haram crisis, not necessarily from the military standpoint of view, but for once, I think it's time the international community paid serious attention to some of the governance challenges and issues in Nigeria, and not least the issue of corruption and the way elections are, stolen and manipulated and rigged in Nigeria, and the international community through various observer missions, giving vote of confidence to those, to such elections, and rushing to recognize the result of such elections and endorsing the inauguration of our government afterwards, largely because of their strategic interest in oil and gas resources in Nigeria and the rest. I think beyond just, the international attention on this crisis has got to go beyond just rescuing the girls. Of course, the kidnapping of the girls is a welcome entry point. However, even if the girls that have been kidnapped today were to be rescued tomorrow, there are no guarantees that this will not happen a month down the line. And for how many times do you want to keep going into rescue? So the internationalization or the international community, there are two critical, things they can't actually do. The first is election is coming up in Nigeria. Even the way the government has handled the crisis so far, there are marks of political calculation ahead of next election on the part of the federal government and the ruling party. So I think the international community, being serious about supporting and ensuring credible elections take place in Nigeria is going to be a key element in this. Secondly, the whole notion of corruption in Nigeria. So much, all the politicians that steal money in Nigeria, they still take their loot outside of Nigeria, investing in properties in Europe and North America. And I think...
Okay, well, let me just stop you there because I wanted to raise some of those issues with Bala here. Dr. Hill was saying that there's a set of elections coming up. How do you think this crisis is going to play into those? I guess one obvious way is that the government's going to say, hey, Barack Obama's saying nice things about us, David Cameron's saying nice things about us, they're going to help us. It's going to play for them politically, do you think?
Yeah, I think the government doesn't intend, well, I think one of the conspiracy theories is that government hopes that he won't hold elections in those areas and then just say that because of the level of insecurity there, we're not going to have elections there. But I'd just like to go back to the issue of social inequalities and the fact that, the National Security Advisor actually mentioned quite recently that they want to take a softer approach. It's not just about a militarization of the whole Boko Haram insurgency. They want to find a way of de-radicalization of alleged Boko Haram members and those that have been caught. And then they're trying to reduce the social and economic deprivation in the area because they appreciate the fact that the situation is not just about the fact that Boko Haram exists. They have to change the whole mindset of the people in that area and give them something to aspire to. And once they can't aspire to that, then it becomes more difficult for you to actually cut off the head of Boko Haram.
What exactly concretely are they talking about? Because we've heard this talk of sort of engagement with the communities. Doesn't often mean there's much money or more jobs.
Well, they're suggesting that they'll come up with something similar to what they have in the South, which is the Niger Delta Development Company, something like that for the Northeast. That would help develop the private sector so that it would provide more jobs and employment for the youth. And until that is done, even if they do go in militarily and they do rescue the girls and they do wipe out most of Boko Haram, they probably won't be able to kill all the members, and then they'll just spring up somewhere else much later if the core issues are not addressed.
Do you think that's a reasonable attitude towards it?
I think from if I go back to the actual politics of next election,
Yeah, go on.
2015 is the next election, and there actually is a school of thought and many people who believe that Boko Haram has a political tinge to them. That obviously there's social economic problems, obviously there's a Islamic radicalism to the actual element, but there are a lot of people domestically and abroad who think that there are certain politicians who are sponsoring Boko Haram to foment trouble in the government, to make Goodluck Jonathan's government seem unstable, for the sheer reason of the power divide, the North and the South. That's been one of the biggest issues. Goodluck went against an internal agreement in the last election for a northerner to run. And now people are saying that because elections are coming up and because the North have been out of power for so long, they are doing their best, whoever they are, shadowy characters, to ensure that domestically the government of good luck is unstable. Now, do I believe that? I question it, because when people bring these up so many times, and there have been various reports, okay, so people should not neglect the political aspect of what, of like a certain angle of like of Boko Haram, and I truly believe that is a certain element of what we're seeing. I'm keeping my eyes open in the run-up to the election, or whether the bombings and the attacks will escalate or decrease.
So, Lindsay, we're coming towards the end of the programme here, but I mean, the picture that we've painted now throughout both halves of this programme is of an intense political economic crisis, of an unstable government, of large degrees of inequality, of a neoliberal regime which gathers the wealth of the country together. I mean, it's far more complex than we're hearing from the Western press, or indeed than you can imagine would be sorted out by any kind of military intervention.
Absolutely, and I think that we're not getting this story at all in the Western press. We're not hearing the thing. But also we should see this is something that is very much a product of economic policies, very much a product of the military and the economic going hand in hand. And they always seem to have money for these sorts of things.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it just there because we've no more time. But I hope that you found this to be an interesting and enlightening view of what's happening in Nigeria. Do rejoin us for future episodes of Analysis, where we'll be looking at the development of this crisis and others on the world scene. Thanks for watching.